No chains, no screaming, no blood. And yet, people lose their minds here. Imagine a place so quiet, you can hear your own thoughts, breathing, echoing. A place where time has no shape, where days feel longer than years. You eat alone. You walk alone. You think alone. This prison does not punish the body. It punishes the mind. It is real. It is legal. It is in America. And once you enter, silence becomes your cellmate. The question is not who belongs here. The question is this: can a human stay sane here? Subscribe now if you want to understand more hidden truths about the world. ADX Florence is one of the most secure prisons in the world. Its official name is the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, but most people know it simply as ADX Florence. It was built in Colorado in the 1990s, a response to a problem that prison administrators believed could not be controlled in any other way. Instead of housing dangerous inmates together, the idea was to separate the most violent, the most unpredictable, and the most influential prisoners from everyone else. The result was a prison designed not just for punishment, but for absolute control. The story of ADX Florence begins with violence. In the 1980s and early 1990s, federal prisons experienced a series of deadly incidents. Correctional officers were killed. Inmates continued to coordinate attacks, even while behind bars. The system needed a place where these risks could be neutralized completely. ADX Florence became that place. It was meant to be the final stop, the prison from which escape, influence, or harm to others was virtually impossible. The facility houses hundreds of male prisoners, a mix of individuals convicted of serious crimes, including terrorism, organized crime, murders of fellow inmates and corrections officers, and other acts of extreme violence. Some are high-profile figures known around the world. Over the years, infamous drug lords, terrorists, and career criminals have been confined here under strict, isolating conditions. What makes ADX Florence unique is the way it limits contact, sound, movement, and even perception of time. Most inmates spend about 23 hours every day alone, in a single cell. The isolation here goes far beyond what exists in most prisons. Each cell is small, roughly 7 by 12 feet, made entirely of reinforced concrete that absorbs sound and blocks view. The bed, desk, and stool are also made of concrete, fixed in place so they cannot be moved. A combined sink and toilet are built into the wall. Meals are delivered through a slot in the door to limit interaction with guards. A narrow slit-shaped window allows light in, but it is angled so that inmates cannot see the layout of the prison or know their exact location. This design creates disorientation and makes it nearly impossible to form mental maps of one's surroundings. Most of an inmate's day is spent inside this cell. For almost all of those hours, they are completely alone. Guards rarely enter, and when they do, it is brief, procedural, without conversation. Meals pass silently through the door. Showers, when permitted, occur either in the cell or in small, controlled spaces, always alone. Recreation time is limited, often about 1 hour per day, and takes place in small outdoor areas, surrounded by high walls. Inmates walk alone, back and forth, with no interaction, no conversation, no connection. Movement inside the prison is tightly controlled and monitored. Inmates are escorted one by one, often in restraints, to prevent any contact with others. Doors are controlled remotely. Cameras cover nearly every corridor. Motion detectors track every step. Panic buttons can lock down entire sections instantly if unexpected activity occurs. Even sound is restricted. Voices carry only briefly and faintly, reinforcing the isolation. The aim of all these measures is simple: reduce risk by eliminating opportunity. Communication between inmates is prohibited. Shared spaces are designed so prisoners never cross paths. The prison functions like a maze, a labyrinth of single-person corridors, cells, and exercise areas. Separation is not accidental, it is intentional. Some units allow slightly more privileges, but even here, contact is minimal. The most restricted areas, like the infamous Range 13, separate inmates completely. Meals are delivered without direct contact. Cells are soundproofed. Doors are controlled electronically. Only a few inmates, notorious criminals, those under strict administrative restrictions, are housed here. Some prisoners are placed under special administrative measures, known as SAMs. These measures are imposed to prevent them from communicating in ways that could threaten national security or other individuals. SAMs can limit phone calls, mail, visits, even communication with attorneys. For inmates under these measures, isolation becomes almost total, cutting off meaningful contact with the outside world as well as other prisoners. In a typical maximum security prison, inmates still interact with each other during meals, work, and recreation. Even in high-security wings, some human contact exists. At ADX Florence, that connection disappears almost entirely. Hours are measured, not in shared experiences, but in silence, solitude, and repetitive routine. Days are indistinguishable from one another. Prison officials argue these conditions are necessary. They say the prisoners housed here have repeatedly shown violence, attempted to manipulate or control others, or possess the ability to orchestrate criminal activity, even from behind bars. Isolation, they argue, prevents harm, protects staff, and ensures security. Critics see a different reality. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, describe the practices at ADX Florence as extreme, in some cases, inhumane, and possibly in violation of international law. Inmates can spend years, even over a decade, under extreme isolation. These organizations point out that prolonged solitary confinement can have devastating psychological effects, and yet it is the defining feature of life here. The conditions at ADX Florence are striking. Prisoners are enclosed in cells that block nearly all sight and nearly all sound. A single, narrow view of the sky may be their only window to the outside world. The lack of human contact, even basic interaction, is total. The continuous absence of connection can erode morale, identity, and sense of self. Mental health care exists, but it is limited. Inmates are screened upon arrival and monitored over time. Enhanced psychiatric care has been introduced after lawsuits and advocacy campaigns, but only a small fraction of prisoners receive interventions beyond standard protocols. The isolation remains the dominant experience for nearly every inmate. It shapes every moment, every thought, every day. Within this structure, some inmates may progress to slightly more lenient units. They may earn privileges like additional recreation, more access to reading materials, or supervised programs. Others remain in near total isolation for years. The rhythm of the prison is mechanical. Lights, meals, door operations, movement, all follow strict schedules. There is no chaos, but also no freedom. Every day is predictable, silent, solitary. The Supermax model is designed to eliminate risk and maintain order, and yet it creates an environment few humans were built to endure. The architecture, the schedules, the limited contact, the soundproof cells, and narrow windows combine to create a life defined not by days or weeks, but by the perception of endless time. Isolation is not just a policy, it is a system that shapes thought, behavior, experience, and identity. Even within these extreme conditions, small variations exist. Some inmates adjust, finding ways to cope within routines. They read, write, exercise, create mental games to mark time. Others struggle. The sameness of every day, the near total absence of interaction, the sensory deprivation, can break focus, alter perception, and slowly erode the mind. The prison is known for preventing escapes, minimizing violence, but its legacy is also one of isolation so complete that the human experience is transformed. In this world, every sound, every movement, every moment is measured. There is no noise beyond what the structure allows. There is no touch beyond what the rules permit. There is no connection beyond what the administrators allow. And yet, life continues. Lights, doors, cameras, and routines maintain control. Meals arrive. Cells are monitored. Guards observe, intervene when necessary. For the outside world, the prison functions with order and efficiency. For the inmates, every day is a test of endurance, patience, and mental strength. The system of ADX Florence leaves almost nothing to chance. Every corridor, every cell, every door, every schedule is designed to prevent contact, communication, or opportunity for chaos. It is a world of concrete, steel, and silence. A world where isolation is law, control is absolute, and the human mind is tested in ways few could imagine. And as the days, weeks, and years pass within these walls, the question lingers: how does a person survive in this extreme environment? How does the mind respond when nearly every element of ordinary life, interaction, routine, connection, is stripped away? What is left when the walls, the silence, the schedules become everything that defines existence? Before we go deeper, imagine silence so complete that your own thoughts start to feel loud, overwhelming, intrusive. At ADX Florence, this is not a metaphor, it is reality. Here, life inside the cell can affect a person's mind in ways few outside can truly understand. The extreme isolation at ADX Florence, where men spend up to 23 hours a day alone, pushes the human psyche far beyond ordinary limits. That much is clear from research, medical reports, and human rights documentation examining what prolonged solitary confinement does to the human brain and nervous system. Experts who study the mind have long warned that such extreme conditions are associated with suffering not just of the body, but of the mind itself. Medical and human rights reports note that holding prisoners in isolation for years can cause dramatic effects on psychological and physical health. These conditions go beyond what most people experience in even the harshest forms of punishment. Inmates at ADX Florence may spend years with almost no direct human interaction, subdued sensory input, and very limited stimulation. Such prolonged isolation is not typical disciplinary time. It becomes a lifestyle inside the prison walls. Decades of psychological research on solitary confinement show that extended isolation is linked with a range of distressing mental health symptoms. People in solitary can develop deep anxiety, intense depression, and panic that comes without a clear trigger. Insomnia often becomes relentless. Sleep turns into a battleground in the mind, where darkness does not heal but magnifies every anxious thought. The list of possible psychological effects reads like a catalog of mind-breaking experiences. Extreme paranoia can take hold, making a person doubt even their own memories. Sensory distortions can occur, where the brain begins to misinterpret sounds, light, or even the sense of time. Some individuals report hallucinations, perceiving things that aren't there, because the brain searches for stimuli that do not exist in the silent, isolated environment. Human rights organizations have pointed out that severe isolation at ADX Florence has been linked to paranoia, perceptual distortions, psychosis, and crippling depression. In some documented cases, inmates suffering intense psychological distress have turned to self-harm or taken their own lives. One prisoner with a long history of mental illness reportedly hanged himself after spending more than a decade in extreme isolation, with only intermittent mental health care. Psychologists who study solitary confinement emphasize that the design of these conditions, constant separation, minimal human contact, lack of sensory stimulation, can create an environment where the brain begins to alter its own functioning. With no social signals and no meaningful external stimuli, neurons adapt in ways that can fundamentally change emotional regulation and perception. In some cases, these changes are long-lasting, even permanent. One expert explains that prolonged absence of interaction and stimulation can damage the cerebral cortex, the part of the brain that makes us most human. When the brain is starved of meaningful input, it compensates by amplifying internal signals, sometimes creating distressing internal noise or false perceptions that feel frighteningly real. Even individuals with no history of mental illness can begin to exhibit symptoms of serious psychological distress after months or years in isolation. In mental health studies comparing inmates in solitary with those in less restrictive conditions, people in isolation showed higher rates of clinical symptoms linked with severe distress. These include depression, anxiety, and a profound sense of social isolation, the kind that makes a person feel lost to themselves and to the world. The absence of personal contact, meaningful activities, or environmental change can erode what many consider the core of human identity. Former inmates who endured prolonged confinement talk about losing a sense of self. Without social interaction, even basic internal dialogue becomes destabilized. Some have described having to talk out loud, just to confirm their own existence, just to hear a voice in the silence. Others describe their thoughts spiraling, looping, in ways that are not under their control. These are not isolated anecdotes. They are consistent patterns reported by many people who have lived under intense isolation. The isolation at ADX Florence goes hand in hand with sensory deprivation. Cells are designed to limit stimuli. There are no open windows showing life beyond concrete and sky. Human voices are rare. There is no crowd noise, no laughter, no casual chatter. Over time, this deprivation can have effects similar to sensory deprivation experiments in neuroscience labs, where lack of external input causes the brain to generate its own internal signals, sometimes strange, sometimes distressing. Not everyone responds the same way. Some inmates develop coping mechanisms. Reading becomes a refuge. Counting steps or inventing rituals gives structure to the days. Journal writing becomes a lifeline. A few find ways to anchor themselves with mental exercise or routine. But for others, the experience wears down the edges of perception, leaving them vulnerable to emotional collapse or confusion. One of the most deeply troubling aspects of prolonged isolation is its impact on identity. Humans define themselves through relationships, through shared experiences, through recognition by others. When that is taken away, many find their sense of self slipping. People begin to question whether they are still the same person they once were. The absence of social mirrors, faces, voices, reactions, can leave the mind grasping for stability. Because of these effects, human rights bodies argue that prolonged solitary confinement should be a last resort and limited in duration. International norms suggest that holding people in near total isolation for more than a few weeks should be exceptional. When it becomes the norm, as it often does at ADX Florence, critics say it crosses the line into cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. This criticism is not ideological. It is based on documented psychological harm that occurs when people are denied normal human contact and mental stimulation for years. Scientific reviews of solitary confinement's effects also highlight how the absence of social and environmental stimulation increases the risk of psychiatric problems over time. Even inmates with no prior mental illness can begin to show significant distress when confined in small, isolated conditions for long periods. The cumulative effect of constant isolation, day after day, can be devastating. In some legal and human rights discussions, experts have pointed out that separation from others, especially when paired with lack of activities or meaningful tasks, leads to heightened stress, hypersensitivity, and loss of emotional regulation. Many people in solitary report feeling overwhelmed by minor stimuli that others ignore: a light flicker, a distant noise, a shadow across the wall. These seemingly small triggers can become deeply distressing when the brain is already strained by prolonged isolation. Mental health professionals who work with people after release from solitary confinement describe challenges in reintegration. Ordinary social situations, eye contact, conversation, even shared laughter, can feel intense or alien. Some people struggle to adjust to everyday life because their brains adapted to a world where contact and communication were scarce. Researchers note that this difficulty in adjusting can persist long after isolation ends, making reintegration into society complex and emotionally challenging. In addition to psychological effects, extreme isolation often intersects with physical changes. Lack of exercise, limited sunlight, and constant confinement can affect sleep patterns, appetite, and stress hormones, creating a feedback loop where physical and mental health deteriorate together. Inmates may experience headaches, disrupted sleep cycles, muscle tension, and other stress-related symptoms that feed into overall psychological strain. What makes these effects especially powerful is not only the conditions themselves, the enclosed cells, the silence, the absence of social contact, but the duration. Months of isolation can be difficult. Years of isolation can be unbearable. The average length of time an inmate might spend under these conditions at ADX Florence can exceed 8 years, a period far beyond thresholds considered acceptable by international standards. Critics argue that when isolation becomes the default environment for so many years, it changes from a security measure into a psychological experiment without consent, a test of endurance of the mind's limits. They call for restrictions, reforms, and alternatives that preserve security, without stripping away the human connections that sustain mental health. These arguments are rooted not in sympathy for crime, but in concern for the human brain's vulnerability to prolonged sensory and social deprivation. And so the story continues, not as a list of statistics, but but as a lived reality for those inside, a reality where silence, solitude, and time become forces that shape not only behavior, but identity itself. And now, as we step away from these walls, it becomes clear that ADX Florence is more than just a prison. It is a test of the human mind, of endurance, of what one can survive when stripped of nearly everything that makes life recognizable. Silence, isolation, endless repetition, these are the realities that shape every day inside. For those who have lived here, life is measured not in hours, but in moments of resistance, in strategies to stay sane, in the quiet fight to hold on to identity. And for the rest of the world, it is a reminder of how fragile the mind can be when the structures of human connection are removed. We may never fully know what it is like to exist in such a place, but hearing these stories, understanding the effects, gives us a glimpse into the extreme boundaries of human experience. It forces us to ask, what is punishment and what becomes cruelty? How far can the mind bend before it breaks? ADX Florence stands as a warning, a challenge, a glimpse into the consequences of absolute isolation. And as the gates close and the silence returns, we are left with a question that lingers long after the story ends. How would you survive if you were here?